So welcome everyone to this innovation workshop, part of the Genesis 2021 conference. How does real estate facilitate the growth of the life sciences sector? As you heard, this meeting is recorded, so that's the warning done. And I'm delighted to have real estate specialists to cover that very important topic that is, well, important all the time, obviously, for life science company, but I think 2021 has seen extra challenges relating to the questions around lab space, lab facility. And so it's great to have JLL today to just show us some of the trends and some work that they've done in the space and how they can support the sector better. So just a bit of housekeeping before kicking off. I would be great, and I think I've done it now, but if you can just keep your microphone and camera off and microphone muted. We'll go through a presentation. If you have any comments or questions, just drop them in the chat box and then we will pick up on them and pass them on to the speakers. It will be time for interaction. So it's just if you can keep that in the chat box, that would be great. And I think that's it on my end. So I am passing the Zoom microphone to Chris Walters from JLL, who will share his screen and show you the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And just before I start sharing, just to say, thank you for joining, and great to have the opportunity to speak to all of you about this subject. By way of brief introduction, for those of you that don't know who JLL are, we are a global advisory business that specializes in the world of real estate. And specifically, I run the UK life sciences team for JLL. So we advise both occupiers and investors across the whole spectrum of the knowledge economy, really. So both focused on working with science and technology users as well as providers of space. JLL's business is global. We have 100,000 people across that whole global business. I'm joined today by some colleagues of mine from the UK business that also specialize with me on the sector, and really excited to partner with Genesis on this event and One Nucleus. I think it's a great opportunity for us to better engage with people who are right at the coalface of the industry and hear from you firsthand about any challenges, any solutions that we might be able to help you find in this sector. So I'm just going to share my screen now. We'll go through some content that we prepared in advance of today. And we'll start by sort of really building on who JLL is, what we actually do in terms of providing services to clients in the life sciences sector. As I said, we look at this not only around life sciences as a standalone subsector, but really the broader knowledge economy and around innovation and R&D. So as I said, I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Paddy Shipp and Bridget Partridge, who will introduce themselves when they get to their piece within the presentation. We're going to do a bit of a triple act today. I would definitely encourage you to ask questions as we go. I can't actually see you ask questions, so Paddy and Bridget are going to be my wingman and woman respectively if it comes up while I'm presenting, and if we can answer it direct when it's relevant to the content being shared on the slide, we will do, but otherwise we'll come back to them at the end, and we should have plenty of time within the hour slot to go through them with you. So between myself, Paddy and Bridget, we're really focusing on this part of the conversation around how we engage with users, how we engage with occupiers of space. And to give you that scene setting in terms of building on the service and who we are as a business at JLL focused on the life sciences sector, the starting point is to say that we have a dedicated team of people that are focused on the knowledge economy. We started looking at this as a potential growth sector back in 2015. And it's really snowballed, to be honest, for us since then. We started this journey because we have a very close relationship with a number of corporate occupiers, where we have either UK, European or global mandates where we help them try and find space in the sector. And over that period, over the past 5 to 6 years, we've built up that team and that offer where we have around 30 people that are dedicated and focused on the sector at the moment in the UK, and a much bigger number of people that are focused elsewhere across Europe and beyond. So we have that dedicated team. The second point is that we've worked very hard to make sure that we not only understand the real estate piece, but we actually understand your business need as a company. And we understand how different macro trends or actions, challenges that are happening within the sector influencing what type of space you need. And that type of space is really sort of linking into the technical requirements, because we understand that there's a broad spectrum of different companies that fall within the life sciences umbrella. We started looking at the data for Office for Life Sciences, for example. I think there were over 30. So we've made that probably easier for ourselves and hopefully easier for clients that we advise by breaking those down into smaller groups and thinking about, well, if this is a type of company specializing in one area, what type of physical space do they need and what type of technical requirements do they have? So we've worked hard to get under the skin of that and understand how that works. And that's meant that we've been able to advise a high number of leases on behalf of clients in the life sciences space. So up to 100 across the UK and EMEA is a really great stat, and it's much larger than that across markets such as the US, for example, which are much bigger. I mentioned that we're a globally connected business. We definitely don't know the 100,000 people that I mentioned earlier, but my counterpart, Travis McCready, who leads the life sciences platform in the Americas, very well regarded person, I think, within that US ecosystem. Really, really important for me personally and for the rest of the team that we regularly speak to our counterparts like Travis, as well as my other colleague, Richard Cheeseman in Asia Pacific, because we've recognized a lot of these challenges are global in nature. They aren't necessarily localized to the UK or particular clusters within the UK. So being able to listen, learn, share that insight with people is really important. We try to make sure that we have a very data-driven approach to understanding market trends. So this is not only looking at what I think of as quite traditional standard inputs around take up of space. So how much space people are taking and what type of companies are taking that space, or what rents they might be paying. It's more around where are company numbers, what's the rate of employment, how is that growing, what's the number of startups, how is venture capital driving the future growth of this exciting industry, and then matchmaking that and patching it together with some of the real estate data to make sure that we're giving a true indication of what is driving this sector. So again, we can go back to that earlier point that I made around understanding business need. And that means that we're able to advise a number of different companies and shapes and sizes. So whether that's early stage startups or spin out organizations, those that are growing. So scale ups is the phrase that we would use to describe them, but you may also hear about grow on space or just rapid growth companies, right up to the bigger corporates. And as you'll know, as an audience listening to this presentation, those business needs vary depending on where you are on that journey, depending on where you are in that growth. That can change over time. So we've been looking at this in terms of the full spectrum of company types, as well as the full spectrum of company sizes. So last one for me, just in terms of service, and then I promise we'll get stuck into the detail of the presentation. But this is really to show you that there is a full property life cycle that we think about when we're advising clients in this space. So I've talked about that upfront insight to make sure that we understand your business and we start off on the right foot. It's then looking at the strategic options. What is the strategy that you want to adopt? How can we help you? How can we actually help you deliver it? Whether that's managing a planning process or managing the design, a multidisciplinary team with engineers, etc. The actual project management or project monitoring. There's a piece around operations. So actually managing your space when it's up and built. Is that an individual building? Is it a campus type environment? What type of services do you need? Is it a pure office? Is it some form of lab space? And finally, the reassessment, which is really our word of saying, making sure that we continue to review what your space requirements are and how that might change. Is your space fit for purpose? Are you able to think about that next step in your growth journey, which is something that Paddy will touch on a bit later on. So as promised, that's enough about Jalal, but hopefully some useful scene setting in terms of who we are, what we're doing, and hopefully how it links into the content today. So we were going to start by talking really around the demand piece. So when we think about demand, it's really looking at what is driving behavior from companies and what we call occupiers to actually find space. Now, the map on the left-hand side, I always say is a bit of a dangerous map, because if you're sitting in one of the emerging groups and you feel like you should be an established group, I apologize in advance, but this is really just to give you an indication of how we look at those different levels of maturity across the UK market. Now, the most advanced, Cambridge, Oxford and London, as we all know, is termed the Golden Triangle, clearly paving the way in terms of growth and activity. But there are some really exciting and really interesting clusters that are already established or coming forward across the rest of the UK. And just on that demand piece in terms of what's driving it, one of the key things that we look at is around venture capital growth. So we've seen over the past 5 years or so that has been performing at a really strong rate. 17% compounded annual growth rate is really strong. But we've recently just looked at some updated figures using data from PitchBook to look at the volume of venture capital into life sciences companies. Now, that currently stands at a pretty whopping figure of 5.85 billion. And to give you a point of comparison, 2.8 billion was raised last year. So we're already more than double what we did last year, based on the most recent figures that we've looked at. 2020 was a record year in itself. It was 10 times higher than the year that we did in 2012. So there shows no signs of slowing around that venture capital activity. And that is the sort of the private sector equity that's driving occupier growth. And then it's not necessarily being matched pound for pound, but it definitely feels like it's being matched in terms of public sector sentiment from UK PLC, that they are continuing to invest in R&D, continuing to push forward the growth agenda around research and development. And naturally, life sciences is a big component of that. So an incredibly, really important demand drivers, I think, for space. And that's causing demand for space across the whole of the UK. So we're engaging with occupiers now who have historically been in one location. They're looking to go to another. They're being driven by things that, again, Paddy will touch on in a minute, around things like talent, for example. So the Golden Triangle is definitely strengthening, but we feel as if these regional clusters are continuing to grow in prominence. And I think something that we certainly expect to happen more in 2022 is those established and emerging clusters continue to go from strength to strength in the coming months. So that's the demand picture. In terms of supply, the map that you're looking at here shows not only the existing supply, so this is either the dark red or the dark black dots. So we're showing the Golden Triangle here in a different color in red, but also the existing supply and development pipeline that's going to come through. And the existing supply within the whole of the UK, we think currently sits at just over 40 million square feet, and that excludes corporate premises. The advanced markets of Oxford and Cambridge by far have the highest concentration of space. London is definitely on the cusp, I think, of really accelerating its provision of space. But there is a short supply. There is a really distinct shortness of specialist lab space within this market. And so what we are starting to see is that occupiers are having to think a bit earlier in terms of what they do. They're also having to look for what could potentially call sort of suboptimal scenarios, really, where they're either having to stay a bit longer in their existing premises and make do, or they're having to convert existing space or existing office or industrial space to make it work for them. Now, that's challenging, and I think that's hopefully one of the segues where we might be able to help in terms of helping you look at what is in the market and get a feeling for where the opportunities might be. The interesting thing is that projected size of supply, we think by 2030 will be over 80 million square feet. So it's going to grow. It's going to grow substantially, but it feels like on the supply piece in particular, there is a bit of a short-term point that needs to be addressed, which is something that Paddy's going to touch on now on the next slide.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Paddy Shipp. I'm a director at JLL, and I lead the advisory side of the business. So I focus heavily on occupier and landlord advice it's very specifically in this space. So kind of exclusively working for either specialist developers and investors or occupiers, anything from a single or two-person startup all the way through to kind of big pharma and everything in between. So just picking up where Chris left there, I think the first point to pick up that I wanted to raise was on kind of the space available in the market. We are at a very interesting point in the market where, with some of the items that Chris touched on, with the amount of VC money and general activity in the market, we're seeing a real lack of product being delivered by investors and developers. Now, whilst that probably doesn't sound like much of a problem, actually it is, because it's an issue for the occupiers, particularly those fast-growing, scaling businesses that have just raised significant equity. Scaling their business and furthering their R&D is going to be difficult if they don't have the right quality of space. Now, looking at the Golden Triangle specifically, next year is not going to be a particularly good year for occupiers to take space in the market. Now, this doesn't cover the rest of the UK, this specific example, but I think it just goes to show, in the most established three markets, having no purpose-built, high-specification labs being brought to the market is going to be damaging to occupiers. And I think kind of supplementing this, what we generally find in our experience in the UK is that from the point of which an occupier raises capital, it takes somewhere between 6 and 9 months to secure their premises moving forward, which they need for their R&D. Now, given where we are in the year now in December, anyone raising capital over the next 3-6 months could find themselves in a tricky position where they're having to acquire suboptimal space, which isn't ultimately good for the R&D that they're trying to further. What we do find as a kind of comparator, which I think is interesting to touch on, is if you look at our colleagues in the US, we have a similar team, as Chris touched on, in North America specifically, where the market is more mature. What we're finding there is occupiers are looking forward probably somewhere between 12 and 15 months ahead of actually acquiring that space, and before they've raised that money, on the anticipation that they are going to get it. Again, the drivers are relatively similar there because space is in such high demand. They are learning that they need to be out of the market sooner. So an interesting learning, perhaps some of the UK businesses might start kind of finding out. In terms of kind of the next two, I guess they're quite heavily linked, but not being able to acquire the right space, as I said, and suboptimal space can be damaging for businesses. It can also damage them locationally, and if there isn't space available in Cambridge or Oxford, in the right part of Cambridge or Oxford, and you want to be near some of the academia or other businesses, and you have to consider being further afield or in a different town or location, that can damage the ultimate goal of which your business is set out to do, and ultimately affect the R&D that you'll be undertaking, which clearly isn't ideal. And the last 2 points, really just touching on how hopefully we will see businesses in the UK looking further forward and trying to anticipate their real estate requirements, which can be complex. And there are not many landlords and investors out there that have the right product, and therefore giving yourself as much time as possible to secure the right space, the right specification, gives you and your business kind of longer period of time to get it right, rather than taking something which isn't quite right. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. So kind of as it says at the top, location. Clearly a very important part of the space that we're working in. I think what I'll do is just go through some of the key items and not all of it. I think the first one is critical. We find this time and time again on the occupier side that being part of an ecosystem really helps innovation, that sort of water cooler moment, being on the same park as someone, science park as someone, just the kind of environment that businesses generally are gravitating towards. I think that's becoming increasingly important, and and has been for some time. Access to finance, clearly, as Chris touched on, venture capital is the lifeblood of the industry in many respects. Whilst that doesn't, I'm not detracting from big pharma investment or UK PLC investment, it is clearly makes up a substantial amount of that. And having access to the right sort of capital out there to help your business ultimately achieve what you're trying to do is critical. To give you an example, in London, for instance, and I won't name any of the investors or companies, but there is one company in particular that they are located in close proximity to a lot of the businesses they're investing in, and it gives them great access to the market, but also it works the other way, where the businesses who are trying to scale, they've got great ideas, they really want to go to the next stage, and to do that, ultimately, they need money. So having that interaction between the two is really positive. And next, and probably most importantly, is talent. I think whatever sector you're in, kind of life sciences and beyond, having access to the right people is absolutely critical to what businesses are trying to do, and therefore, the strength of the Golden Triangle comes out in that regard with the universities that captures, but also just kind of grabbing postgraduates and researchers that you want to help further your product, being in close proximity where they have been living or would like to live going forward, I think is massively important. Particularly in a London context, we see that with King's, UCL and Imperial, and businesses spinning out of there trying to essentially throw a net around the three universities and continue to attract the best talent to help further their business. Access to intellectual property, pretty linked in terms of academia. One thing we find with one of the clients we advise is that some of the equipment and the research tools that the universities provide can be really useful to a growing, scaling business who don't have the capital to purchase that equipment, and therefore having particular links to academia can be really critical for business who are in super growth mode, until businesses get to a point at which they, perhaps it makes more economic sense for them to buy certain pieces of equipment. Particularly in the early stages, we see that as critical, and therefore locating from the university that you are at or that has a strong chemistry faculty or whatever it may be, is often of paramount importance. You've probably touched enough on the next one, and finally, I think specialist infrastructure. I think the ability for landlords to create space which allows businesses to expand and contract different elements of their businesses is really important. This is something that landlords have done to a reasonable degree so far in the UK, and I think it's going to get a lot better, particularly with a lot of the investment that's coming into the market. I think the key bit that I find on the occupier side is knowing that when you are taking space from a landlord or investor, that you're transacting with someone that has a good track record, knows what they're doing, and is providing the right space. Because there's a lot of space that occupiers have retrofitted or taken because they are absolutely desperate for space. The landlords don't understand the needs of these businesses, and ultimately it can end in quite a detrimental position for both. And so actually the more sophisticated the market's becoming, I think that's really helping occupiers secure the best space with the best landlords who know what they're doing and understand this part of the market, which I think, as we all know, is fairly specialist. That's me, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. Just to, I suppose, zoom out a bit now in terms of one of the things that we wanted to ensure we include in this presentation is talking to you about macro occupier trends that we think will influence the behavior and the way that businesses, companies will think about the way that they take space. So all of the things that Paddy's just said, incredibly important, particularly at a local or a regional level. But one of the things that we did is that we interviewed a large number of our pharma and biotech clients. So as you'll very quickly realize, all of the people sitting below this sort of diagram are anonymized on purpose. But the idea is to give you a feeling and a flavor for how some of the bigger corporate occupier clients in this space are thinking about how they use their real estate. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got people who are using, again, 100% office, so employees are back to work and primarily being in the office, and at the other end of the spectrum, 100% remote. What's really clear is that quite a large sort of bunch of those companies sit in the middle, so they are not at one end of the spectrum or the other, and there is a very high proportion of hybrid working. Now, I think the way that someone works is, from a personal perspective, I think quite individual. You know, it really depends on what your individual setup might be at home versus the office, depending on what type of activity that you do, whether you feel as if you need more face-to-face engagement with a client or not. But what's interesting, I think, is when you're looking at it in the world of pharma and biotech, which naturally, I think one of the main obvious things that happened when COVID did hit last year was that the real estate investor market, particularly landlords who owned portfolios of space related to the science and technology community, realized that, you know, you can't do labs at home. You needed to be within that environment to undertake the research and development that you were doing. And it had an impact, but probably more so on the office or the back office type functions of their business. And now, obviously, people have been moving back into the office. The government guidance has changed, and we're starting to see this hybrid model, which was being embraced by a number of corporate clients for some time, probably be a bit more embraced than it ever has been. So we've got this hybrid approach where some staff might be in one location versus the other, depending on the type of activity they're doing, if it's manufacturing or production based, or, as I said, more of like a back office function. So this is an interesting slide, I think, for you to think about in terms of, where do I sit on this spectrum? Have I even done this assessment as a business to think about where I am now and where I might be in the future? And hopefully it's a bit of a conversation starter internally about what that optimum model is for you, based on what your business is and what you think it might be doing in the future. The other thing that we wanted to look at from a macro perspective is looking at sustainability. And there is absolutely no doubt that the impact of the built environment in terms of real estate has a huge impact in environmental terms. So you know, the impacts in terms of the amount of water we use, the amount of electricity, the amount of raw materials, the amount of carbon that we put into the environment is substantial. But you know, life sciences is naturally a big contributor to that because of the way that we use that space. So the fact that life sciences occupiers use up to 10 times higher the amount of energy, or 4 times the amount of water. There's 138,000 hectares per annum of plastic waste that's created. So what we did as a business, when we were thinking about how we could engage with the industry in a different way outside of the pure real estate sense, is think about how we can embrace sustainability and try and be part of the conversation about how we could not only look at the challenges, but how we might be able to put forward solutions to mitigate those challenges. So we did a first piece in a thought leadership series that was launched a month or so ago, where we focused on this environmental side of the equation. It was clear from the engagement that we had that because of those challenges, I think there was barriers in terms of embracing the principles of environmental sustainability from users of space. What's very clear, even at a personal level, a day-to-day, that you can see the public sentiment, rightly so, is shifting quite significantly to make sure that we are taking this into account in the way that we live our lives, the way that we use resources. So there is a need to change, and that will come both from top down in terms of regulatory, political, financial, but also sort of bottom up in terms of your workforce, your employees, saying that they want to be working for and part of as in a sustainable, friendly business. So as I said, laboratories do have that disproportionate impact. Most of the action that we've seen to date in this space has been from the corporate occupiers rather than from the scale up or startup businesses. But I think we have started to see that change even in the past 6 months. Paddy and Bridget are leading the charge in terms of occupier engagement. And I think we've started to see that coming in earlier in the conversation than it has been before, which is really just linking back to what I was saying around the sentiment moving. So the costs have been high. We started by looking at the challenges. You could say that was the easier place to start really on this journey. The solutions piece around the second phase of thought leadership will take place in the first quarter of next year. And we think there is this opportunity to be driving forward the vision and the ambition in this space through engaging with clients. So there is a big impact around sustainability, but why is that important to you as a business? And we've touched on a number of these already, but things like the social responsibility piece is really important. The ability to make sure it has alignment with brand values, the ability to attract talent, which, as Paddy said, is so pivotal in this sector, probably not more so than any others, but definitely very high up the agenda. It allows you to future-proof the way that you're looking at your assets. So one of the things I mentioned earlier around the reassessment piece is making sure that you're using that space that's fit for purpose and that it is going to look after your long-term vision. And there are a number of others here that I won't dwell on in any detail, but I would recommend that if you want to sort of get under the skin of this a little bit more, then the sustainability paper that we've done is, as I said, a useful insight, I think, in terms of what we're seeing from engagement with both occupiers, but also investors, so that you can see both sides of the coin when looking at this space. And Bridget.
Thanks, Chris. My name's Bridget Partridge. I work alongside Paddy in the South East Agency team, specialising in life science. Focus heavily on the Golden Triangle. Previously, I worked in Cambridge for 7 years. This slide shows obviously just a number of clients that we've worked with globally over the years. Anything from, as Paddy mentioned, kind of 1 to 2 people in a small incubator up to your large corporates. We've recently represented a client in Cambridge who was struggling to find fitted lab space. As we previously mentioned, there's a distinct lack of supply, and unfortunately they only had about 6 months to occupy in order to continue their growth. Pleased to say that we just completed on that. They've taken 50,000 square foot of fitted lab in South Cambridge. So that's just one example of an occupier that we've represented. And then moving on to the next slide. This basically just covers how we actually act for them. As the others have kind of touched on, for us, it's just really important for us to understand the actual needs of the businesses. And from there, we can then help guide and try and source the exact property requirement that the business needs. I think sometimes on the early days of talking to the occupiers, they don't always understand exactly what they will need, and definitely won't necessarily considered what that means in, say, 5 years or 10 years' time. And we appreciate for a lot of these businesses that they are growing so fast and may have, say, funding rounds of kind of 2 years, and how this will actually impact the growth of the company and what this then means in terms of their properties. We may, for instance, suggest that they could actually take some larger spaces and then look at kind of subletting, for instance, just to ensure that they've actually covered off that growth for the future. And especially in markets such as Cambridge, Oxford, where there aren't the supply, especially in that kind of fitted lab market. So again, we start kind of with where exactly do you need to be, how this location is actually going to affect the business. Is it important for you to be part of a cluster, part of a business park? Are you looking to grow substantially? Therefore, are you needing to understand where potential employees are living and how they're actually going to get to that location? So there's no point having an amazing facility if unfortunately people aren't actually going to be able to get to you. So it's just really understanding what exactly the needs are. And at that stage, we can then look at reviewing what the market has. And also importantly, we understand each of these individual markets. We have a lot of knowledge and intellect for things that are actually off market, for instance. So we may be aware of opportunities that aren't apparent that could work for you in 6 months' time, for instance. We would then look at reporting all these options so you can get you out viewing, and then understanding the costs and the effects on the business. Once we've then looked at hopefully deciding on a property and then negotiating to make sure that you receive the best deal, we would then help you on the legal process as well. We understand obviously for you, the property obviously is very important, but your day-to-day job is based on the science. So we're there to basically help you through this process to make sure you can concentrate on the R&D. Another point which we can help on, not only on the agency side, is we have teams across the business who can then look at, say, your specialist fit out and looking at that workplace and how you wish to potentially design the space. Some of the places obviously may be fitted, but you may have ended up with, for instance, a shell and core option where you actually need to create your whole entire fit out and create those breakout areas as well as your specialist lab equipment. So we have everything like that within JLL that we can then offer to support you so that you can then just move in and then start working straight away. So ideally, we try and make it as easy as possible so you can concentrate on the important science.
Great. So thank you very much for listening, everyone. Hopefully that was a useful insight in terms of how we're seeing the real estate infrastructure, particularly changing in terms of demand, supply. We also touched around some of the bigger occupier trends that we're seeing, and finally, just on the process piece about how we might be able to help. You can see that our contact details are up on the slide at the moment. Feel free to get in contact with us directly. Paddy, Bridget, myself, and a colleague, Zoe, will also be at the event on Thursday in person. We'll be doing some form of rolling shifts, I believe. So we may not all be there at the same time, but definitely one of the team will be there if you'd like to ask us any questions face to face. But we've definitely got some time left now. We thought it would be useful to leave some time today to open up the floor to any questions that you may have. Equally, if you prefer to do that on a one-to-one basis, then happy to do so. So I'll stop sharing now and see if there's any questions in the chat function. No, I don't think there is. Is there anyone who's tuned in listening who'd like to ask something?
There's one, Chris.
Oh.
Which is, can the sustainability paper JLL have written been shared? How early on in the process should occupiers start thinking about their property needs? Do you want to do the first bit and I'll do the second?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be shared immediately after this. If we're really clever, we might be able to post it actually in the chat function right now. But we can definitely circulate that back into the One Nucleus Genesis team, no problem.
And I think on the second part, in terms of how early in the process should occupiers start thinking about the property needs, I think really, if you are VC funded or raising capital to grow, once you start considering that that's your next step, I think at the same time you should start considering your property requirements. Giving yourself as long as possible is absolutely the best approach to take here, and that is largely driven through hopefully some of the themes that came out today, that you really need to start considering property requirements sooner rather than later. Otherwise, you could be stuck having raised lots of money, which is fantastic, but not having the right facility or the capacity to grow, which is obviously really debilitating for businesses.
Okay.
There's no further question. Can I ask a quick one? Sorry, Aline.
Of course.
Back.
Of course.
Yeah, it's just on the trends, because obviously you're the first witness on how these ecosystem move and grow. And what you pointed around is, and we're seeing every day about the shortage of lab space available for companies in this golden triangle. Do you think that's shifting a bit where ecosystem go? If companies are struggling to find space, are they looking at going somewhere else? And therefore, is there, I don't know, opportunities for growing ecosystems in other places? Is it sort of opportunity for the rest of the UK to also build their own ecosystem, which ultimately I think would be good, because then you can cross-link that with the Golden Triangle. But is that something you're seeing? So companies who would have located in Golden Triangle, but actually going somewhere else, and that's good. That's creating this virtual cycle.
I think we're at a critical point now where, particularly with next year and the real lack of supply coming through, some businesses their hand might be forced in that regard. And as Chris alluded to in his slide, the rest of the UK is there's some very well established locations and emerging locations that are more than suitable to accommodate a number of occupiers that are currently in the Golden Triangle, and frankly vice versa as well. So I think that is absolutely possible. I think one issue that we are finding that we didn't touch on, but I don't want to get too far into the sort of UK planning law, but planning is quite restrictive in the UK at the moment, and planning dictates that when buildings can be built or refurbished, and without planning and some of the hurdles to planning, that's significantly slowing down the speed of delivery for some of the lab space all across the UK. And that is something which hopefully it doesn't, but could kind of critically impact the industry if some of the planning policy isn't relaxed in certain locations to help science users take space.
I think, just to add to what Paddy said, I think in general terms, the way that I know there's a lot of groundwork that goes into being able to receive that venture capital investment, but the speed of that capital being raised is much, much quicker than the delivery of physical real estate to deliver buildings. I think that one of the main issues that we've got at the moment is the property lag, the time lag between needing the space and being able to deliver the space. And so one of the interesting points that Paddy mentioned earlier for me was, we recently went to see our colleagues in Boston, and they were saying to us, we know that these companies need space within a maximum of 9 months, but the way that they're thinking about that next move has completely changed because of the way that the real estate market is providing that space, and that there is this time lag. So I think being able to think as far in advance as you possibly can, we fully appreciate that this is a fast-paced industry where the nature of the space you might need today could be very different to what it could be in 3-6 months time, but with as much certainty as possible, where, as Bridget said, you might over-egg it day one, but if you over-egg it at day one and you've got yourself some expansion space, there's no reason why you couldn't sublet that space to a third-party occupier. That's better than going sort of too thin at the beginning and then being in a position where you need to move quicker than the last time, because it's that movement of a business from one location to another that is costly, it's disruptive to business. And I think hopefully one of the main things that where we can help is just the ability to be as efficient as possible without disrupting the main day-to-day business, which is what these companies are here to do. Really, the real estate should be an enabler of you to be able to do that job rather than a barrier or a challenge. And I think being forward thinking as much as possible will help that.
Thanks. And and I think this message about planning ahead, that's critical. What you may see you're faced with companies is that wasn't really in the system. They were not raising that much money before, so they didn't have to think about this very large space from day one. But I think it's getting in. And subsequent question: do you help them with that? So, for example, companies who are in the process of fundraising and therefore don't necessarily have the money, but come to you and say, "I will need that in a year time." can you help me find it and secure something without it being a huge financial commitment? I really don't know how that works. It's just a random question. If you can help companies in that respect of thinking ahead without having to burn the bank.
Yes, I think so. I mean, for all of the main markets in the UK, the slide that I showed earlier, where it showed the existing supply and the future development pipeline, you know, as a business, we track all of that future supply, so we know how much space is coming and when. So yes, from a real estate perspective, we could absolutely say, well, if we started that conversation earlier and it was looking 12 months ahead, say, for example, about where you might want to go, the type of things that we could help look at is, okay, based on your business activity, what's the preferred locations, where are the options, looking at the development pipeline in that search area, which areas or which buildings, or there might be ground up development starting from scratch, will be coming to the market. And then I think if your question was more linked to how we might be able to help raise or sort of provide business support to the company to help raise funding, we have relationships with the VC funds, so could help enable that, but we are not, I suppose, an advisor in the same way that some business support or innovation services type companies would be. We are still sort of rooted in the real estate piece, but we have a full appreciation of the different component parts, so we can help do some matchmaking for sure, and hopefully help that way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry, that was not meant to say to help them fundraise, but more to provide, for example, guarantees when they are fundraising, to say, oh, okay, we're speaking to these people, and they can help us securing the space, which can help them then, therefore, raising money. But no, definitely that answers it.
Okay, great.
Great.
Any other questions from the floor? Okay, well, thank you once again for everyone's time. Appreciate the questions as well. We'll, as I said, we'll be there in person on Thursday. Feel free to get in contact directly if you'd like to speak about anything on a one-to-one basis. Very happy to do so. And we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone. It's really interesting presentation. I saw good comments in the chat box as well on how useful that was. Thanks for sharing the link about sustainability in life science. I hope everyone got it, but I also have it and can reshare with whoever attended. And as you mentioned, you're here on Thursday, so for those who are, you can meet with the JLL team directly or to make contact directly on the app. On my end, just to mention, there are a few other innovation workshops coming on. So one after that on with Catalan on sort of drug discovery key requirements, and then further tomorrow and Friday, big day being on Thursday, and then of course some more on-demand content as well to watch on the app. So hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll see you all either online or in person on Thursday. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.